Naruto, and that was my October. Really good, warm memories, new friends, just the happiest I've been in a while, being shown a lot of love and trying to reciprocate. On top of all the activities, I did a lot of reading this month too. Well, a lot for me at least. I read 8 books and enjoyed all of them, so excited to share my thoughts on what I read, because it was also a really solid reading month on top of just an existing month. So the first book is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. Okay, so where to start with this other than saying I loved it front to back. It's so smart and snarky and cynical and witty and encantering, like enrapturing. This was one of the easiest things that I've ever read. Not because it was written simply or digestively, because at some points it's not, but I just loved the way that it was written in the sense that I couldn't get enough of it at once. I just wanted to take in every page immediately. Again, it's just so smart. I just loved how simple and full-bodied everything was, where it just centers around a day in the life of this character, and as you watch them interact with the world, you learn things indirectly about their past or their views on life, which, like I said, are cynical at times or existential at others, but there's always a sense of curiosity that's really endearing and leaves it feeling optimistic or positive in some sense. I love the takes on grief and loss and focusing on the present and how fleeting things can be, and still finding beauty in that despite it all. All the while, there's queerness at the centerfold of this without it seeming tokenized, which is great. There's also some academia themes. It's a campus novel to a certain extent, but you're seeing it through the eyes of a professor. Just, it's such a good book. Finishing it made me feel something that I've been chasing for a while, and I love reading, but some books are just made for you, and I feel like this was one of them. Yeah, I love this. I love this. It's so good. After this, I read Pure Color by Sheila Heti and have some thoughts. Okay, so I know this book is kind of divisive in terms of you either loved it or you hated it, and if I had to just pick between those two options, I would say I loved it, although not all of it worked for me. I'll try and keep this short because I know everyone has talked about this book already. It was really popular this year, like a booktube darling, but this book is kind of sparse story-wise. It's about this like very introspective narrator who is reflecting on their life and love and loss specifically, which sounds vague, but there's a lot of spiritual concepts that are introduced in this. I would say like over half of this book is just introducing kind of analogies and metaphors and these ideas or like abstract concepts to the reader, not to the point where it kind of does feel like info dumpy at some points, or kind of the line between like the narrator's thoughts and the author's like philosophies on life kind of gets blurred a little bit because it does feel pretty personal. So this book attempts to like make a lot of points, and I would say it only really missed twice for me. The 2 times would be like the fixers and then the first and second draft, which if you've read it, you probably remember. And if you don't, not that big of a deal. The problem I had with it wasn't like the concepts themselves, although some of it did go over my head. It was more like the way it tried to deliver them, because it really tried to nail down these sort of like abstract spiritual concepts by just repeating them over and over and over and rephrasing it in a bunch of different ways a lot of times. And it started to feel towards the second half of the book like trying to reach the word count on an essay and just restating the question as part of your answer so that the sentence is like twice as long. And it got kind of annoying because it was like there's a lot being written but nothing really being said. Aside from that kind of major complaint, I really liked this book, which is why I'm kind of torn, because on one hand, yes, not all of it worked for me, but on another, I was so moved by the parts that did that like it completely cancels out in my mind. Like I really enjoyed this book, and I can overlook the kind of glaring flaws that I feel like this does have because of how affected I was. This book is super soft and sincere and delicate and like romantic, but in a very internal sense. The narrator is really introspective, and the way that they navigate life and kind of talk about coming to terms with love and death and how they intersect is just really beautiful and super intimate. And it kind of makes me question what I want out of a book, because I read this and I did have, those initial complaints, but at the same time, and it elicited such like intense emotions that I don't know what outweighs what, because isn't it the point of books to like connect with them, to be moved by them? And I feel like I did. And if the way it went about doing it was flawed. Does it really matter? Like, at the end of the day, isn't it about what I got out of it? And I feel like I got a lot out of it, so I don't really want to complain about it too much more. So I won't, I guess. I really like this book. Okay, the next book I read was Checkout 19, and oh boy, this book felt so unique to me. Like, it felt like a very singular reading experience, which might just have to do with the fact that I'm not super well read, but I don't know, maybe it's not distinct, or maybe it's been done before, but I've never read anything that was this wry and funny and addressed not only books, but like the act of reading itself and reading the book that you're reading, and also herself just as a character. Like, this is fiction, but it feels very like self-inserted or like auto-fictional, where it's told in like a very non sequitur or almost incoherent ramblings, like as if the words that you're reading are part of a conversation that you're overhearing someone have with themselves, and as they're talking to themselves, they're trying to like remember the story as they tell it. It's absurd. The story itself is them recounting their life from early girlhood and school, struggling to work well with others, and writing as a form of escape. They had like group projects and crushes on teachers, and connecting with the world through writing and stories absorbing and kind of reflecting and refracting their environment, and places that she can't go, places that she can only reach through reading. I don't know if I am getting that across correctly, but there's a lot of like early girlhood like staples, like finally menstruating and kind of reveling in the act of that, the options of it, the colors, and repeating things that she hears adults say without fully understanding them. It's like really charming and funny and cheeky and irreverent. There's also a lot of like admiration for art, books specifically, but also paintings, and they're described in such a detailed way, where not only literally like what a painting looks like, but what emotions it evoked and the surrounding connotation or like historical context of it, how it affected her life and her interests, which were so engaging because there's a lot of admiration, there's a lot of like bittersweet observations. Like, her memory is so good. I get that this is fictional, but like I feel like it's her like telling stories, and I don't know, her interests were just so engaging. There's a lot of musings on relationships and the machinations of men that she was with who tried to control her and police her interests, and the dynamics that created, as not only with her like specifically, but also her as like a writer and as a reader, avoiding certain poets like Sylvia Plath or like Anne Sexton or Virginia Woolf, not only because the man in her life tried to like forbid it, but because she was scared of her thoughts not being her own, of being overtaken, and that if she did end up reading these very depressed and like suicidal authors and ended up killing herself, that it would be their feelings instead of her own, that she'd be overtaken by something else. And that sort of fear of like the power that books have, in the sense of like her being half formed and kind of flimsy and looking for something to fill her, and having books be that because they're so established and detailed and like full bodied and like able, and like the sense of dread that an author can create is just amazing. Like, thoughts like that I would have never had like on my own, you know? And there's so many books talked about in this, so many paintings, so many authors, and like it's almost to the point of like Maggie Nelson, where it's like so referential to other things without it being like a glossary or like an appendix. But I don't know, dude, it's insane. It's like if Maggie Nelson wrote a grocery list on art. It's just list after list after list of like author and book and painting and song and event and like place in the world. And I mean, there's a subplot also, like there's a story to this that on top of everything is also great. Like, it focuses on a story that she read and her trying to retell it as an adult after sort of losing it or forgetting it and forming it again. Lots of focus on just writing itself. And I'll stop. Okay, this book was amazing. It was like hypnotizing, and I loved the cadence of it. I don't know, this book was amazing. I will stop. This book was so good. Okay, I got way too hype. I really liked all of these books though, and I'm really caffeinated, so I'm just like getting too into it. I'm gonna bring it back down a level. Okay, the next book I read was Walking Through Clear Water in a Pool Painted Black by Cookie Mueller. This is a nonfiction memoir style short story collection that covers the life of her as like a hippie turned underground movie star turned go-go dancer turned hitchhiker. It covers her life front to back, from like her travels and these very insane elaborate stories and nights of her life. They're not all positive though, like there's some heavy stuff covered, with a lot of her life taking place in the underbelly or the nightlife of whatever city that she's in at the time. She definitely feels like a grimier version of Eve Babbitt's, which is the most direct comparison, or the one I feel like people have made a lot. Although I don't really see them as being that comparable, aside from it being like 60s nightlife recounted stories. This is definitely way more drugged out, and if Eve Babbitt's does coke, then Cookie Mueller does black tar heroin, literally. She definitely does a lot of like harder drugs that range from like the psychedelia of the 60s, between having sex with Jimi Hendrix and almost meeting Charlie Manson, to eventually harder drugs and like the cocaine and martini technicolor world of house parties and art house, and then later on heroin while raising her son between odd jobs, like I said, like a go-go dancer or a fashion designer or attempted playwright at one point. So breakneck in pacing. There's a lot of short stories that are just really fun, short, engaging, almost unbelievable. Like, I don't know if they're all true because some of them felt like way too coincidental. Her life is really hectic though, and it's a lot of like just uprooting and going to a different place, and the way that she tells stories, they're almost embellished, like I said, and like she's playing it up for a friend, and it makes it just all the more enjoyable. It does become fictitious stories at one point, like ones that she wrote herself, and there's also like posthumous articles that she'd written, or like eulogies at some point. Like, the book has a lot of range, it's not just one note throughout, and I really enjoyed this. If you like Eve Babbitt's, definitely check it out. It's a similar vein, although it's a lot less glamorous, less moral, and more unfiltered. It's a great book. It lost me a bit in the end when it's like the advice column, like newspaper magazine stories, but overall, I really enjoyed this. Okay, next is Heaven by Mieko Kawakami, and this book was angsty and reflective and teenage. Like, it's steeped in this sense of adolescence and a lack of understanding that it captures really well. You're seeing things through literally unexperienced eyes, sorry for the pun, but it's these two victims of bullying at middle school that start talking to each other through letters that they exchange, and the relationship that ensues between them defines both of their lives and changes it a lot. There's a lot of really mature ideas about how to live, like what defines weakness and what defines strength, and how they're not independent of each other, or they're not opposites, and also the way that right and wrong play into what you should or shouldn't do. But having these really mature and like intelligent themes be expressed through the vehicle of middle schoolers didn't really work for me. Like, these are 13-year-olds that are monologuing about like existential reductionism and morality, and it kind of broke my immersion. Although I will say that I read another Kawakami last month, and I enjoyed this one way more. The story feels a lot more contained and structured and easy to follow, and had a lot of intimacy while not being romantic, which I really admire. It felt a lot more muted and undefined as a love story, where it was more about just trying to find both a place and a way to belong. I enjoyed it a lot more than All the Lovers in the Night, which I don't think that you need to compare between her books, but that was my first one and I didn't really love it, and I just feel like this has sort of regained some of the confidence in her as an author, and I'm excited to read Breast and Eggs now. Then after that I read Dead End Memories by Banana Yoshimoto, and I had a really intense experience reading this, like in a positive way. I'm not sure what it was about the story, or like the way that this depicted relationships or like outlooks on life in a very kind of sad and grainy, but undertoned by this like sense of optimism and like hope. It was, like I said, cold and reflective and melancholic, but it ended up being so sweet. I don't know, it just really struck a chord with me. This is a collection of 5 stories about different women who navigate life and grief and learn, basically, and 3 of the 5 stories made my eyes water. The last one made me cry like tears of joy, and that's not a normal emotion to get from a book. I can't think of another time that I've cried like positively, or like been moved to tears in a positive way. I feel like most books just get you to cry out of sadness, but this just gave me this sense of clarity about my own life, and just made me very, very aware and then subsequently grateful for where I'm at, which is really nice. I had a great time reading this. I was outside listening to good music. My friend had made me a playlist, and then finally there was like some nice weather in Texas, and I had the sun on my legs, and it was cold enough to wear a jacket, and I was drinking chai, and I just, in the present, I felt so good. And the fact that I was able to have that experience to like read for leisure and feel loved in that moment, and then be moved by the book. It was like, art is a luxury and so is time, and I just felt so like present and happy and grateful. Loved this book. Thank you so much, Cam, for recommending this. I had such a good time reading it, and it kind of like changed my outlook on life a little bit. I don't know if that's like too strong of like a sentiment to like take away from this. I don't know how much of the book was doing all like the heavy lifting, or like if I was just like emotionally processing, and then like the book just kind of pushed me in the right direction and I took it from there. But whatever it was, I read this at the right place at the right time, and super loved this. It was, yeah, amazing. Again, like, I don't know what more you could want out of a book than like having a moment like that. Yeah, it's kind of perfect in that sense. So after that, I read The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector, and wow, this book made me dizzy in a good way. I have never felt so confronted by language in my life. It was really hard to read and to grasp, but because of how simple it was and how intense and like sporadic the punctuation was, it felt like it broke my brain. It was like breaking a ton of rules of like punctuation and like intonation, and the sense of storytelling through not telling a story was so bizarre. And once I thought I got used to it, I just couldn't get enough of it because I was so invested in the story. I loved the sense of like unreliability and like the frantic, like manic, frenetic writing that felt flawed and romanticized and unnerving and kind of rotten. This book was super short. It's like 70 pages, I think. So I won't be saying anything at all about like what happens in the story, because it's so fun to go into it and just see it unfold. I was stunned, like literally, and in a sense this book was great because it challenged me and I felt rewarded for being able to like dissect it or like digest it. This book is super skinny, and it still took me days to get through because I needed time to process it. I'm simultaneously scared and also really looking forward to reading more by her, because this book was crazy. So nobody was gonna tell me that my hair looked like that for the entire video. Okay, y'all are fake as fuck for that. But the last book I read was Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Fuck me, man, this book was amazing. And I know I've like gushed about every book, but like every book I read kept being so good. This one was so fucked. I don't even know how to like convey. I could sit in silence just like grimacing for the last like 2 minutes. Fuck it. Okay, this book was so emotionally charged in every way, but it was never like overbearing, and it also tells a story in an interesting way where it starts with the ending and then kind of explains how you got there, which gives you this sense of like melancholy and reflection to all of the story, even when it's in the present tense. And the story itself focuses on this man who is coming to terms with his queerness and mourning his identity, his shame, his grief, and his true feelings. And it's so tender and fractured and feels auto-fictional at some points, because Baldwin himself, being both black and gay in the early 1900s, really understands like the negative emotions that surround queerness, as well as the beauty of it. And I feel like depicting both is so important and done so well in this. Not that you should ever like separate art from the artist, but I don't think it's possible in the first place to do that. I couldn't stop thinking about Baldwin writing this, like what he wanted to convey and release by making this. Like, fuck. In the first chapter alone, I teared up twice, and I was like, this book is gonna destroy me. It's so succinct and electric, with great advice and dynamics between the characters, and like these old and young men both kind of facing love and shame and paranoia. And there's some really beautiful extrapolations of reasons not to make certain decisions, like thought processes of each character that are really tragic. Like I want to highlight that point because now that I'm saying it, like I realize how much of this book surrounds just admitting something or being unable to, like the refusal to allow yourself to admit something, and the reasoning behind you not doing it, like choosing to leave things unsaid because of like this tragic, flawed, like agonized but also honest reasoning and like interpretation of like your emotions, whether it's like between the protagonist and his father or like between his lover. It's like there's so many just flawed relationships that are oh, fuck man, this book is so good. Okay, one parallel that I do want to highlight is the movie Moonlight. This scratched such a similar itch for me in like the sense of like this formative queer relationship as a teen and then spending the rest of your life splitting yourself in two, trying to both deny it and also embrace that part of yourself, like running all like running from yourself until you just end up where you started and then just mourning the time that you lost. Oh my god, like fuck, this book was so good, point blank period. This book was so good. So was every book I read this month, honestly. Like I could pick any of them and be like, yeah, that's the best book I've ever read ever. I loved every book I read this month. So if you have recommendations based off of anything in a similar vein, my hands are open. Please, I want more of what I read this month. Or if there's something completely left field and you're just like, I think you would like this, let me know. Because I finally feel like I'm getting to a place where I'm not just dictated by library holds of what I have to read, because I'm finally working my way through them. I think I only have like 4 holds right now, so I can kind of throw other stuff into the mix for the rest of the month, or the rest of the year, I guess. But yeah, just open to suggestions. This is basically just me asking for book recommendations. So if you have any, let me know. I would love some. Okay, yeah, thanks for watching and goodbye.